I never thought a bowl of miso soup would change everything. But looking back now, sitting in my quiet kitchen with the morning light coming through the window the way it always does, I think that was the moment I finally understood what had been happening right in front of me for 2 years. My name is Margaret. I'm 63 years old. I taught high school Japanese for 22 years in a small town in Oregon, raised one son mostly on my own after my husband passed, and I like to think I did a decent job of it. My son Daniel is kind and hardworking and genuinely good. He got that from his father. And when he told me he was getting married to a woman named Soo-Jin Park, I was nothing but happy for him. I still remember how his voice sounded on the phone that night, lighter than it had been in years. I want to be honest with you right from the beginning, because I think honesty is the only way a story like this makes any sense. I was not a perfect mother-in-law. I probably called too often in the first year. I probably showed up to their apartment once or twice without enough notice. I was lonely. Daniel was my only child, and I was still learning how much space to leave between us now that he had a life of his own. I was learning. I want you to remember that. Soo-Jin was beautiful and sharp and ambitious. She worked in corporate finance at a firm in Portland, and she was clearly very good at what she did. She wore her confidence like a second skin. I admired that about her, honestly. I thought we might become close in time. I thought she might teach me things about her world the way I might share things about mine. I brought her flowers the first time we met, yellow tulips, because Daniel had mentioned offhand once that she liked yellow. She thanked me politely, set them on the counter, and we never mentioned them again. I told myself that was just her way, that some people aren't flower people, that I shouldn't read into things. Over the next 2 years, I watched myself become smaller around her, not in a dramatic way. There was never one big moment I could point to and say, that's when it changed. It was quieter than that. It was the way she'd answer Daniel's questions at dinner, and then let mine sit unanswered a beat too long, just long enough to feel like an oversight, but never long enough to call out. It was the way she'd glance at her phone when I talked about my garden or my old students or anything that belonged to my life before her. It was the way she started calling me Margaret instead of Mom, which I had never asked her to say but had quietly hoped for. The way you hope for things you know you have no right to demand. Daniel didn't see it. Or maybe he saw it and didn't know what to do with it, which is a different problem entirely. He's a fixer by nature, my son. He doesn't like conflict. He gets that from me, if I'm being honest. So, when I mentioned once, just once, that I sometimes felt like Soo-Jin and I weren't quite connecting, he got this look on his face like I'd handed him something heavy and breakable, and I said, never mind, I'm probably being silly, and we never talked about it again. I got very good at saying never mind. What kept me going, what made the loneliness bearable, was Soo-Jin's grandmother. Her name was Halmoni. That's what everyone called her. It just means grandmother in Korean. And she had come from Seoul to live with Soo-Jin's parents in their home in Beaverton when she was 81 years old. She was tiny and white-haired and had a laugh that belonged in a much bigger body. Soo-Jin's mother, who had been born in Korea and moved to the States in her 30s, brought Halmoni to every family gathering. And from the very first time I met her at Daniel and Soo-Jin's engagement dinner, Halmoni had looked at me across the table with these sharp, patient eyes and said something to Soo-Jin's mother in Korean. Soo-Jin's mother had smiled and translated for me. She says you have a kind face. She says she can tell you've known real sadness, and that makes you trustworthy. I hadn't known what to say. I had just smiled and looked at this tiny, fierce woman, and felt, for the first time in months, like someone in that family actually saw me. Here is what nobody at that table knew. Here is what I had never thought to mention, because it had never seemed relevant. I don't speak Korean. But I spent 22 years teaching Japanese, and I have spent most of my adult life studying East Asian languages as a hobby the way some people do crosswords or garden. Korean and Japanese are not the same language, They're different in vocabulary and in culture, and in countless ways I could spend hours explaining. But the grammatical structures share certain logic. And more than that, over the years I had picked up Korean slowly, imperfectly, the way you absorb anything you love without meaning to. I could read Hangul. I could follow a conversation if people spoke at a natural pace and the topic was familiar. I was not fluent, but I understood far more than anyone would have guessed. I never brought this up. It never occurred to me to announce it. When you've taught a language your whole life, you stop thinking of language skill as remarkable. It's just something you do, like knowing how to change a tire or read a map. And besides, nobody ever spoke Korean around me. Sujin's family was careful and considerate in my presence, always switching to English when I was in the room. Everyone except, occasionally, Sujin. Not often. Not in ways I could fully catch at first. Small things. A comment to her mother across the table. A sentence murmured to Helmani while she thought I was distracted by dessert. I caught fragments. Not enough to form a picture. Just enough to leave me with a feeling I couldn't name. A low hum of unease that I told myself I was imagining. I was very good at telling myself that. The dinner happened in March. Daniel's company had just landed a significant contract with a firm based in Seoul, and his boss had organized a celebration dinner at a nice restaurant in downtown Portland. Daniel had been working toward this deal for over a year, and I cannot describe to you how proud of him I was. He called me when it came through, and his voice did that lighter thing again. That thing I'd been waiting to hear. And I cried a little after I hung up the phone, in a good way. Sujin organized the dinner. She was the one who knew which restaurant, who arranged the private room, who coordinated everything beautifully because she was excellent at those things. Daniel told me she wanted the families there, that it was meant to feel warm and personal for the Korean executives who were flying in specifically for the signing. He said the Seoul team placed high value on family. He said it would mean a lot to them to see that Daniel came from people. He asked me if I wanted to come, and I said of course, absolutely, I wouldn't miss it. In the car on the way there, I remembered Daniel reached back and squeezed my hand from the front seat, the way he used to do when he was small and we were driving somewhere new. And he wanted to make sure I wasn't nervous. I held on to that. The restaurant was beautiful. Low lighting, dark wood, flowers on every table. The Korean executives, 3 men and 1 woman from the Seoul office, along with their local liaison, were already seated when we arrived. Sujin's parents were there, and Halmoni, who had dressed up in a silk blouse the color of good jade and was sitting very straight in her chair looking absolutely magnificent. There were 11 of us altogether, arranged around a long table in a private room off the main floor. The evening started warmly. The Seoul team spoke excellent English and the conversation moved between English and Korean in a natural, fluid way. Sujin translated when needed, smoothly and professionally. I was proud of her for that. I sat next to Halmani, which I was glad about, and we did our small ritual of communicating. She would say something in Korean and look at me with that patient amusement, and I would respond in Japanese. And somehow, between the two of us, we had always managed to be understood. Daniel was glowing. I kept watching him from across the table. This man who had once been a boy who slept with a stuffed bear until he was 9 and cried at the end of every school year because he would miss his teacher. And I thought, I did something right. Whatever else I got wrong, I did something right. Then the soup came. It was miso soup, the restaurant's specialty, served in small lacquered bowls. One of the executives, the older one, Mr. 20, Kwon, who had kind eyes and had spent the evening being gently funny, turned to Sujin and said something in Korean, quietly, while the servers were still moving around the table. I wasn't trying to listen. I want to be clear about that. I was reaching for my water glass, but the table had gone briefly quieter, the way it does when food arrives, and I caught it. He was asking Sujin about me. I caught enough to understand that. He was asking who I was, what my connection to Daniel was, whether I lived nearby. And Sujin answered him. She spoke in a low, pleasant voice, the kind of voice that is designed to sound like casual small talk. And I understood most of it. Not all, but most. Enough. She told him I was Daniel's mother, that I was a widow, that I meant well. And then she said something that made me set down my water glass very carefully with both hands so I wouldn't drop it. She said, and I want to be precise, because I have gone over this many times in my memory. She said that Daniel had a hard time setting limits with me, that I had been showing up often before they asked me not to, and that I was still adjusting to the fact that Daniel had his own family now. She said it lightly, the way you describe a minor inconvenience. She even smiled. Mr. Kwan made a small, sympathetic sound. She said that she managed it and that she was patient, but that it was sometimes a lot. The room was still warm. People were still talking. Daniel was laughing at something the liaison had said. Nobody had noticed anything. Sujin was already turning back to the table, smooth and composed, as if she had said nothing more remarkable than a comment about the weather. I sat very still. I knew, in that moment, that I had a choice. I could react. I could let her know right there in that beautiful private room, in front of Daniel's colleagues and the Korean executives and her own grandmother, that I had understood every word. I could watch her face change. Part of me wanted to. I will not pretend otherwise. Part of me wanted it very badly. But I looked across the table at Daniel, who was still glowing, who had worked for this for over a year, who had squeezed my hand in the car, and I made a different choice. I picked up my soup spoon. I turned to Halmani, who was watching me with those sharp, patient eyes. And I understood, for the first time, that she had heard it too. She didn't say anything. She just looked at me steadily for a moment, the way very old women sometimes look at you, like they've seen every version of the situation before, and they're waiting to see which kind of person you'll turn out to be. Then she reached over and patted my hand twice. Small, firm pats. And she went back to her soup. I made it through the rest of the dinner. I ate. I answered questions when people asked them. I smiled at the right moments. I watched Daniel sign the final papers at the end of the evening, the whole table applauding, his face full of something I can only describe as arrival, like a person who has been traveling a long time and has finally gotten somewhere worth being. On the way home, he called me from the car. He does that sometimes, calls me right after he's left somewhere, like he's still carrying the warmth of it. "Thank you for coming, Mom," he said. "It really meant a lot. The Seoul team loved meeting everyone. I'm so proud of you," I said. And that was true. That was completely true. I didn't say anything else that night. But I did not sleep. I lay in my bed in my quiet house in the dark, and I thought about everything. Not just that evening, all of it. Every dinner where my questions went unanswered, a beat too long. Every phone call that got shorter and shorter. Every time I'd said, never mind, I'm probably being silly. Every time I'd made myself smaller to fit inside whatever space I was given. And I thought about what Sujin had said. That Daniel had a hard time setting limits with me. That she managed it. That she was patient. I thought about how confidently she'd said it. How easily. How like something she'd said before, to other people, in other conversations. And that was the thing that stayed with me the longest. Not the words themselves, but the ease of them. This was not a private frustration slipping out in a vulnerable moment. This was a story she'd been telling, a version of me she'd been passing around. I am 63 years old. I have buried a husband and raised a child and taught hundreds of students and lived alone for many years and made peace with most of it. I am not, I think, a fragile person. But lying there that night, I felt something crack open in my chest. Something I hadn't known was still holding itself closed. I let myself feel it. All of it. I didn't try to talk myself out of it or reframe it or find the generous interpretation. I just lay there in the dark and let it be as bad as it was. And then, sometime around 3 in the morning, I made a decision. I was not going to become the woman Sujin had described to Mr. Kwan. I was not going to shrink any further or make myself any smaller or apologize for existing in my son's life. But I was also not going to explode. I was not going to make a scene or send a long email or call Daniel sobbing at midnight. That was not who I was, and more importantly, that was not who I wanted to be. I was going to wait for the right moment. And when it came, I was going to be honest. Just honest. Quietly, clearly, without performance. The moment came 3 weeks later, and it came from Halmoni. Sujin's mother called me on a Tuesday afternoon. She said that Halmoni had been asking for me specifically, that she had something she wanted to give me, and could I come to their home in Beaverton on Saturday? I said yes, of course. I brought flowers again, yellow, same as always, and a box of mochi I'd found at an Asian grocery in Portland. When I got there, the house was quiet. Sujin's parents left us in the living room together, which surprised me. Halmoni sat in her chair by the window with her silk-straight posture and her sharp eyes, and she looked at me for a long moment without saying anything. Then she said, in Korean slowly and clearly, "You understood her." It was not a question. I looked at her. And I said, in Japanese, slowly and clearly, "Yes." She nodded. Like that was the answer she'd expected. Like she'd been waiting for me to admit it. Then she spoke again, and she was careful to be clear, to use simple words, to make sure I followed, and I did follow, most of it, filling in the gaps with the logic of things. She told me that she had lived a long life, that she had been a daughter-in-law once and a mother-in-law later, that she knew what it looked like when a woman was being slowly pushed to the edges of her own son's life, that she had watched it happen at that dinner, and she had sat with it for 3 weeks, because she did not interfere in what was not her house, but she wanted me to know that she saw it. And she wanted me to know that what I had done, staying still, not reacting, letting Daniel have his evening, was not weakness. It was the opposite. She reached into the pocket of her cardigan and took out a small folded piece of paper and held it out to me. I unfolded it. It was a note, written in Korean, and I could read enough to understand it. It was an apology, written in her handwriting. It was addressed to me. It said, "Mothers should not be made to feel like inconveniences in their children's lives. I am sorry that happened at my granddaughter's table." I sat with that piece of paper in my hands for a while and didn't trust myself to speak in any language. Eventually I looked up and she was watching me with that patient look, and she said something else, shorter, that I understood completely. She said, "Tell your son." I did. Not that night. Not in the heat of anything. I waited until a Sunday 2 weeks later when Daniel came to my house for lunch alone. Sujin was at a work event in Seattle, and we sat at my kitchen table with coffee the way we used to when he was in his 20s and had problems he didn't know how to solve yet. I told him what I had heard at the dinner. I told him I understood Korean. I told him what Sujin had said to Mr. Kwan as accurately as I could remember it. I didn't cry. I didn't accuse. I just told him. He was quiet for a long time after I finished. The coffee got cold between us. He said, "Mom, are you sure you understood it right?" I said, "Daniel, I taught languages for 22 years. Yes." He was quiet again. He said, "I didn't know she felt that way." I said, "I didn't know she felt that way." I said, "I know you didn't." He said, "I'm sorry." And I said, "I know you didn't." He said, "I'm sorry." And I said, I know you are." Because he was. I could see it on his face, the particular kind of pain that comes from learning something about someone you love that you can't unknow. I was not glad to put that there, but I was glad to finally stop carrying it alone. I don't know what conversations happened in their house after that. That is not my story to tell. What I can tell you is that things changed, slowly, the way real things change. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in small, steady increments. Sujin called me 2 weeks later, and we talked for 40 minutes, really talked about things we'd never talked about before. It wasn't easy. It wasn't warm exactly. But it was honest, and honest was more than I'd had before. She said she hadn't realized how much she'd been venting about me to other people, that she'd convinced herself of a version of me that wasn't entirely fair. She said it stiffly, like someone reading from a list. But I've been around enough people to know that saying a hard thing stiffly is still saying it. That takes courage, too. I told her I appreciated it. I told her I knew I hadn't been perfect either. We agreed to start over, which is maybe the most adult thing two people can do. Halmoni passed away in October of that year, quietly in her sleep, in the house in Beaverton. I cried harder than I expected to, for a woman I had only ever spoken to across the space of 2 different languages. We had understood each other perfectly. I think about what she said to me that Saturday in her living room, about being pushed to the edges, about staying still being the opposite of weakness. I think about that folded piece of paper in my kitchen drawer, which I still have, which I will probably always have. I am not a burden. I am not too old. I am not an inconvenience to be managed. I am Margaret. I am 63 years old. I taught languages for 22 years and raised one very good man, and I have known real sadness, which, according to a fierce and remarkable woman, makes me trustworthy. I am still learning how to take up the right amount of space. I am still learning. But I am done making myself smaller to fit inside whatever room I'm given. And if there's anything I want you to take from this, whether you're a mother or a daughter-in-law or someone who has ever felt themselves fading quietly at someone else's table, I want you to know that staying still is not the same as disappearing. That dignity is not the same as defeat, that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply wait and watch and know your own truth and hold on to it. Because someone will see it eventually. Someone always does.